9:14 a.m. The Taiwan Strait. Broad daylight. The sky is overcast, a flat gray ceiling sitting at 4,000 feet that diffuses the morning light into a shadowless white that makes every surface look washed out and slightly unreal. The strait itself is 110 miles wide at this latitude. The water a dark gray-green that matches the sky, running a slight chop from the northeast at 8 knots. Visibility is excellent despite the clouds, 12 miles in every direction, and in that visibility, moving south at 11 knots on the center line of the international shipping lane that bisects the strait from north to south. USNS Impeccable was conducting her assigned mission. USNS Impeccable was not a warship in the conventional sense. She carried no weapons. She was a Teagus-class ocean surveillance vessel. 5,000 tons of specialized acoustic intelligence collection capability, operated by the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, with a crew of 26 civilian mariners and a military detachment of 18 U.S. Navy personnel. Her mission was the most important and most unglamorous work in naval intelligence: listening. Her towed array sonar systems, the CERT-S LFA array, trailing 800 meters behind her, were continuously collecting acoustic data on submarine activity in the Taiwan Strait and the surrounding waters, building the picture that U.S. Pacific Fleet needed to understand PLA Navy submarine movements, to track the signatures of specific vessels, and to maintain the acoustic intelligence baseline that would be essential in any Taiwan contingency. She was doing this work openly, in international waters, as she had every right to under international law, and as U.S. Navy surveillance vessels had done for decades. She was unarmed. She was slow. She was, in the PLA's operational assessment, a high-value target that would be catastrophic to lose and extremely difficult to defend. At 9:14 a.m., 4 PLA Navy vessels emerged from the western haze at high speed. 2 Type 055 Renhai-class guided missile destroyers, among the most capable surface combatants ever built by any navy outside the United States, running at 30 knots on a course that would intercept USNS Impeccable within 8 minutes. Behind them, 2 Type 726 UE-class air cushion landing craft, the same vehicles used for amphibious assault operations, each capable of carrying a full combat-equipped PLA Marine force, closing at 45 knots. Above the formation, 2 Z-20 naval helicopters orbited at 2,000 feet, their door gunners visible from the bridge of USNS Impeccable through binoculars. The PLA commander aboard the lead Type 055 transmitted on the bridge-to-bridge radio at 9:16 a.m. His message, delivered in accented English, was direct. He stated that USNS Impeccable was conducting illegal reconnaissance activities in Chinese territorial waters. He directed the vessel to immediately stop engines, prepare to be boarded, and follow the Chinese vessels to the port of Fuzhou for inspection. He stated that any resistance would be treated as a hostile act. USNS Impeccable's commanding officer, a civilian mariner with 22 years of military sealift command experience, acknowledged the transmission, stated that his vessel was operating in international waters under international law and had no obligation to comply with the direction, and immediately transmitted an emergency report to 7th Fleet Headquarters in Yokosuka on every available frequency. In Beijing, the Politburo Standing Committee had authorized this operation 46 hours earlier. The seizure of USNS Impeccable, the physical capture of a U.S. Navy intelligence collection vessel in the Taiwan Strait, was the single most audacious PLA naval operation since the founding of the People's Republic. Its strategic rationale was layered. The acoustic intelligence data aboard USNS Impeccable was of extraordinary value. The SURTASSLFA arrays collected baseline on PLA submarine acoustic signatures represented years of irreplaceable intelligence. The propaganda value of a captured American naval vessel would be historic. the demonstration that the PLA could exercise physical sovereignty over the Taiwan Strait by seizing a U.S. military asset in broad daylight would reshape the entire regional security calculus. And the capture would give Beijing a negotiating chip of incalculable worth. An American vessel, American military personnel, in Chinese custody. The operation had been named internally at the Central Military Commission as Operation Sea Sovereign. It would prove to be the most consequential military miscalculation since the founding of the People's Republic. China had made 6 catastrophic mistakes. First mistake: the 2 Type 055 destroyers had been tracked continuously for 29 hours. A pair of F/A-18G Growlers operating from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa had been conducting a classified emissions collection mission over the Taiwan Strait when the Type 055S departed their pier at Zhoushan Naval Base at 4:17 a.m. the previous day. The unusual departure time, the specific vessel combination, 2 of the PLA Navy's most capable surface combatants leaving together on a heading directly toward the Strait's center line, and the electronic emissions pattern consistent with pre-operational weapons system checks had been assessed by 7th Fleet Intelligence as indicative of an imminent intercept operation against a U.S. surveillance asset within 4 hours of the vessel's departure. USNS Impeccable had been notified at 9:44 p.m. the previous evening, 11.5 hours before the PLA vessels reached her, that a high-confidence threat to her safety was approaching. She had been directed to maintain her mission while a response package was assembled and positioned. Second mistake: USS Milius was 11 miles away. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, operating under partial emissions control on a parallel track south of USNS Impeccable, had been positioned there specifically in response to the 7th Fleet Threat Assessment. USS Milius was not a coincidental presence. She had been detached from her routine patrol at 11 p.m. the previous evening and had been running in emissions-controlled mode, not broadcasting on AIS, her radar in passive collection mode, rather than active search. For 9 hours, the 2 Type 055 destroyers that had been maneuvering at 30 knots toward USNS Impeccable had not detected USS Milius. When the emergency transmission from USNS Impeccable reached 7th Fleet at 9:16 a.m., USS Milius was already turning toward the intercept on a course that would put her between USNS Impeccable and the PLA formation in less than 12 minutes. She had been waiting for this moment for 9 hours. Third mistake: 4 F-35C Lightning IIs from USS Ronald Reagan were already airborne. USS Ronald Reagan had been operating in the Philippine Sea east of the Strait and had been placed on enhanced alert status when the 7th Fleet Threat Assessment was issued. 4 F-35Cs had launched at 7:47 a.m. on a combat air patrol specifically covering USNS Impeccable's operating area. They had been holding at altitude in the gray overcast above the strait, their AN/APG-81 radars in passive collection mode, their weapons fully loaded, their pilots monitoring the USNS Impeccable situation through the Link 16 and Tactical Data Network. When the emergency transmission was received, the F-35Cs were already descending through the overcast on a vector toward the PLA formation. They reached visual range of the PLA vessels at 9:24 a.m., 10 minutes after the intercept began, and 4 minutes before the Type 726 landing craft reached USNS Impeccable. Fourth mistake: the air cushion landing craft's approach route had been assessed and covered. The 2 Type 726 UE-class vehicles, running at 45 knots on a direct approach to USNS Impeccable's position, were the operational centerpiece of the seizure plan. Their speed and cargo capacity intended to deliver a PLA Marine boarding force onto USNS Impeccable's deck before any U.S. response could arrive. What the PLA operational planners had not modeled was the MH-60R Seahawk helicopter that had been operating from USS Milius, already airborne. that reached USNS Impeccable's position at 9:22 a.m., 2 minutes before the landing craft. The Seahawk, armed with AARGM 114 Hellfire missiles and M197 rotary cannon, established a weapons-ready orbit directly over USNS Impeccable's deck and transmitted on the PLA tactical frequency. Any attempt to board the vessel would be treated as an attack on a U.S. military asset and responded to with immediate force. The message was unambiguous. The landing craft slowed. Fifth mistake. The two Type 055 destroyers were in an extremely exposed tactical position. The Type 055 is one of the most capable surface combatants in the world. Its HHQ-9B surface-to-air missiles, its YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles, and its Type 346B AESA radar system make it a match for almost any naval surface threat it might encounter in open ocean operations. Against F-35Cs, whose radar cross-section is effectively undetectable, to the Type 346B radar, and whose AIM-120D AMRAAMs have a range that substantially exceeds the engagement envelope of the Type 055's self-defense systems. In a strait that is 11 miles wide at the current operating position, with USS Milius approaching from the south and USS Ronald Reagan 200 miles to the east, the two destroyers were not in a position of strength. They were in a position from which escalation had only one direction, and that direction ended with two of the PLA Navy's most valuable warships at the bottom of the Taiwan Strait. Sixth mistake. The PLA had no prepared response to USS Milius physically positioning herself between the landing craft and USNS Impeccable. The seizure plan's operational model had accounted for a U.S. surface combatant response arriving within 2 to 4 hours, too late to prevent the boarding and seizure. It had not accounted for a U.S. destroyer that had been positioning for 9 hours. That was already in the strait. That reached USNS Impeccable before the landing craft and placed herself physically between the PLA force and the vessel they intended to board. USS Milius closed to within 900 meters of USNS Impeccable at 9:26 a.m., established a parallel course, and transmitted on the international distress frequency. Any attempt to approach USNS Impeccable would be assessed as an attack on a U.S. Navy vessel and responded to accordingly. She had her fire control radar in active mode. Her 5-inch gun was manned. Her Harpoon missile launchers were trained toward the Type 055 formation. The message required no translation. What happened in the next 47 minutes ended Operation Sea Sovereign and restructured PLA Navy operational planning for a decade. At 9:28 a.m., the PLA commander aboard the lead Type 055 found himself in a tactical situation that his operational orders had not prepared him for. His two landing craft were stopped in the water 500 meters from USNS Impeccable, held at standoff by a Seahawk helicopter directly overhead. USS Milius was between his force and the target, her weapons systems active and oriented at his ships. 4 F-35Cs were circling overhead at medium altitude, visible on his radar as ghostly, intermittent contacts that his operators could not build firm tracks on. A clear indication that they were operating in emissions-controlled mode and choosing when to be seen. And USS Milius's active fire control radar was painting his lead destroyer continuously, a tactical signal that every naval officer in the world reads correctly. He transmitted to his fleet command at Zhoushan requesting guidance. The reply from Fleet Command took 11 minutes to arrive, which itself was informative. The hesitation indicated that the Central Military Commission, which had authorized the operation on the assumption that no significant U.S. response would be present, had not anticipated the actual tactical situation and was deliberating under conditions of significant uncertainty. At 9:39 a.m., the PLA commander received his orders. He was directed to maintain his position, but not to escalate. He was not directed to withdraw. He was not directed to proceed with the boarding. He was left in a position of tactical paralysis, holding station in international waters with his mission objectives unachieved, and a U.S. destroyer 900 meters from the vessel he had been sent to seize. At 9:41 a.m., 7th Fleet transmitted its own message to the PLA commander through the established military-to-military communication channel. The message was formal, precise, and legally grounded. It stated that USNS Impeccable was a United States military vessel operating in international waters in accordance with international law. It stated that any attempt to board, impede, or interfere with USNS Impeccable would be treated as an attack on a U.S. military vessel under the laws of armed conflict. It provided the PLA commander 45 minutes to withdraw his force to a distance of 25 nautical miles from USNS Impeccable's position. It stated that failure to comply would result in immediate defensive action. The 45 minutes that followed were the most tense in the Taiwan Strait since the Third Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995 to 1996. The PLA formation held its position. The F-35Cs continued their orbit. USS Milius maintained her station. The Seahawk continued its weapons-ready orbit over USNS Impeccable. USNS Impeccable herself continued south at 11 knots. Her SIRTAS array still deployed, still collecting. Her crew at muster stations, her commanding officer transmitting continuous situation reports to 7th Fleet every 4 minutes. At 10:24 a.m., 43 minutes after the 7th Fleet message, the PLA Type 055ES began their withdrawal. The landing craft turned first, their high-speed air cushion lifting them clear of the water as they accelerated northwest toward the Chinese coast. The two destroyers followed, turning to a heading of 290 degrees at 20 knots. The Z-20 helicopters turned with them. Within 19 minutes, the entire PLA formation had opened the distance to 25 nautical miles. USNS Impeccable continued her mission, but the response to Operation Sea Sovereign was not limited to forcing the PLA forces' withdrawal. The operation itself, the deliberate attempt to seize a U.S. military vessel in international waters, constituted an act of aggression under the laws of armed conflict that the United States was not prepared to allow to pass without material consequences. The response had been planned and authorized in the same 46 hours during which the PLA had been preparing its operation. It was not punitive in the conventional sense. It was designed to eliminate the specific capabilities that had made Operation Sea Sovereign possible, and to establish a material cost that would shape PLA decision-making for years. At 10:31 a.m., 7 minutes after the PLA formation began its withdrawal, USS Ronald Reagan's strike package was already inbound. 12 aircraft launched at 10:11 a.m. 8 F/A-18E, Super Hornets, 4 EA-18G Growlers. Their targets were 3 PLA Navy surface surveillance radar installations on the Chinese coast, whose feeds had enabled the Type 055 commanders to track USNS Impeccable's position and plan their intercept. EA-18G Growlers activated their jamming at 10:38 a.m., degrading PLA coastal air defense radar coherence across the target area. The FA-18Es released AGM-88 AARGM missiles at standoff range at 10:41 a.m. All 3 radar installations were in active emission mode. All 3 received AARGM impacts on their antenna and transmitter infrastructure between 10:49 a.m. and 10:54 a.m. All 3 were rendered inoperable. Simultaneously, USS Milius and USS Gravely, which had transited north through the strait at flank speed after the standoff resolved and was now in position, fired a combined Tomahawk salvo of 38 missiles beginning at 10:33 a.m. Their targets were the Zhoushan Naval Base Pier complex, from which the 2 Type 055 destroyers and the 2 Type 726 landing craft had sortied, specifically the maintenance facilities, the fuel and ammunition handling infrastructure, and the command building of the PLA Navy's East Sea Fleet Surface Warfare Command that had directed Operation Sea Sovereign. The Tomahawks impacted between 10:49 a.m. and 10:58 a.m. in a sequenced strike. The pier complex's covered maintenance berths were rendered inoperable. The fuel and ammunition handling facility sustained direct impacts that produced secondary detonations. The Surface Warfare Command building was struck by 4 Tomahawks in a terminal sequence, B-1B Lancers from Guam, launched at 9 a.m. when 7th Fleet issued its highest tier response authorization, struck the PLA Navy's Taiwan Strait Operations Center at Fuzhou at 11:04 a.m. 48 AARGM JASSM missiles distributed across the facility's 5 main structures. The Operations Center, from which the real-time coordination of Operation Sea Sovereign had been conducted, and from which any follow-on operations in the strait would be directed, was comprehensively rendered inoperable. The communications infrastructure, the computing center, the intelligence fusion cell, and the backup command facility were all struck. The operations center, that had been activated 24 hours before Operation Sea Sovereign as the dedicated command node for the operation, was inoperable within 11 minutes of the first JASSM impact. The full accounting, compiled by 7th Fleet and U.S. Indo-Pacific Command by 1 p.m. USNS Impeccable, undamaged, mission complete. Arrived Yokosuka for scheduled maintenance 4 days later on schedule. All 26 civilian mariners and 18 Navy personnel. Safe, unharmed, not boarded. U.S. personnel who sustained fatal outcomes, 0. U.S. vessels rendered inoperable, 0. PLA vessels that attempted the seizure. All withdrew under U.S. military pressure. None achieved boarding of USNS Impeccable. 3 PLA Navy coastal radar installations rendered inoperable by AARGM strikes. Zhoushan Naval Base Pier Complex maintenance infrastructure rendered inoperable. Fuel and ammunition handling facility rendered inoperable with secondary detonations. PLA East Sea Fleet Surface Warfare Command building comprehensively struck. PLA Navy Taiwan Strait Operations Center at Fuzhou rendered inoperable. PLA Navy personnel who sustained fatal outcomes across all strike packages, 106. U.S. aircraft rendered inoperable, 0. At 11:17 a.m. USNS Impeccable transmitted her routine hourly situation report to 7th Fleet. Her CERTAS array was still deployed. Her acoustic collection was still running. She was continuing her assigned track, collecting the data she had been sent to collect in international waters that no declaration and no intercept operation had made, or would ever make anything other than international. The 2 Type 055 destroyers that had been sent to seize her were 60 miles away and opening, returning to a base whose pier infrastructure was burning and whose command building had been struck by Tomahawks. The landing craft that had been sent to board her had never reached her deck. The Seahawk that had held them at standoff was back aboard USS Milius, refueled and rearmed, and USNS Impeccable was sailing south, doing her job, as she would continue to do. In Beijing, the Politburo Standing Committee that had authorized Operation Sea Sovereign on the premise that no significant U.S. response would be present, received its post-operation assessment in extended session. The operation that was supposed to seize a U.S. intelligence collection vessel, capture its acoustic data, and establish PLA physical sovereignty over the Taiwan Strait had instead resulted in a full U.S. military response that had been pre-positioned before the operation began. That had neutralized the seizure attempt without firing a single weapon in the strait itself. And that had struck 3 radar installations, a naval base, and the operations center that had commanded the attempt. All within 90 minutes of the PLA forces' withdrawal, the American vessel that was supposed to be in PLA custody was in international waters, still collecting. The data that was supposed to be in Chinese hands was in U.S. Navy databases, and the physical sovereignty over the Taiwan Strait that the operation was supposed to demonstrate had instead produced the demonstration that the United States would respond to any attempt to seize U.S. military vessels with immediate and material consequences against the infrastructure that made such attempts possible. USNS Impeccable's SURTASS array collected 4 additional acoustic contacts of significant intelligence value during the afternoon of the same day. The data was transmitted to 7th Fleet in the evening report. It was exactly the kind of data that China had tried to prevent her from collecting. She collected it anyway. This is what happens when you attempt to seize a United States Navy surveillance vessel in international waters. You do not find an isolated, undefended ship with no support and no awareness of your approach. You find a vessel that was warned 11.5 hours before your destroyers arrived, that had an armed destroyer positioned between her and your boarding force before your landing craft reached her. You find F-35Cs that have been overhead since before you reached the operating area. Holding in the overcast, where your radar cannot build solid tracks, you find that your 45-minute tactical paralysis, while the Central Military Commission deliberated, was all the time 7th Fleet needed to authorize and begin executing a response package that struck your radar network, your naval base, and your operations center before the afternoon was out. You send your 2 most capable destroyers and your fastest landing craft to seize one slow, unarmed survey vessel. You achieve nothing except the demonstration that the Taiwan Strait remains international waters, that U.S. military vessels operate in those waters under U.S. military protection, and that the infrastructure used to threaten them will not survive the attempt. USNS Impeccable continued her patrol. The strait remained free, and the acoustic data she collected that afternoon was some of the most valuable she had produced in months. The ocean belongs to everyone. The United States Navy enforces that fact. It always has. It always will.